If you're having to create a lot of motion graphics for your videos on a regular basis, it's good practice to stock up on different elements that you create ahead of time and just collect in a library that you can use later. And one of the most common and useful elements like that would be backgrounds. Subtle animated backdrops for whatever you want to throw up on the screen, like some text or a logo. It's nice to have things that you can just put right behind it instead of having to create everything from scratch when you're on a tight deadline. And the most important aspect of these backgrounds is that they be loopable, because you never know how long the background animation might need to be in a future situation. So you make it a certain number of seconds, but you want to make sure that no matter what's happening, no matter how complex the animation, how many elements there are, that it can get to the end of it and then loop seamlessly into the beginning so that you can, make it the backdrop for an entire video for like 20 minutes or something. So I wanted to go through the process of creating something like that and making sure that it's completely seamless and completely loopable. And I'm going to try to just use the stock After Effects filters and effects and no special plugins or footage or graphics or images of any kind. We're going to make everything from scratch. The only little plugin I'm going to use is a free plugin from Video Copilot, which is called Effects Console. I mapped it on my keyboard to show up whenever I press Control Space. And it's just a little browser to dial up. It's the same as this effects and preset browser, but just more convenient. So I'm going to use that to call up pretty much any effects. Just be aware of that. And you can download it for yourself for free from videocopilot.net and follow along. So let's dive in and create this thing. I'm going to start by making a comp. I'll click here to create a new composition, and I'll make it 1280 by 720. And let's make it 10 seconds. That's a decent enough length to create some motion that won't feel repetitive when it loops. So we have an empty 10-second long composition, and I'll create a solid by pressing Command Y. It'll be the same size as the composition, just a boring gray color. And on this, we will create our first element, which I think should just be a noise, a kind of murky, smoky texture. So let's add the fractal noise effect, which is a common go-to effect when you're not quite sure what you're going to create. I will change it to dynamic and invert it, and I'll make it pretty large so that it's just a few strands, kind of a swirly marble pattern. Now, to introduce a little bit of motion and animation, we can use this evolution parameter and animate it over time, and it will undulate like this. And as you can see, it's a circular knob that goes 360 degrees and then counts a revolution, and you can do more than one revolution. But I will reset it to 0 and keyframe it on the very first frame that we're on right now. Then I'll skip to the last frame by pressing the End key, and then I'll type 1 here, and that'll automatically create a second keyframe. And if I preview this, obviously it's going to animate, and I like this speed. It seems like one full revolution for 10 seconds gives me the speed that I want. But of course, at the end, it cuts. When it starts to loop over again, it cuts to a completely different state, and it's very clear that there's a cut. Luckily, if we want to make it seamless, there's an option here in the evolution options. If you just check this box, it'll make every cycle of this knob, every time it passes once by default, which is regulated here, it will actually be seamless. So now if I go to the first frame and I toggle between the first and last frame, you see they're identical, which is perfect because it'll just go through all this motion and then end up in the same place and start over. But to be perfectly precise, what we should really do, and I'll press U to reveal the keyframes, is we should move this last keyframe over one frame, because we don't want these two frames to be identical, because it'll play the last frame and then the first frame, and effectively we'll have a freeze frame for one frame, which wouldn't be noticeable in something so abstract. But to be perfect, let's move this one frame forward. So what we're seeing at the end is the frame right before this first frame. So now we've got our seamless undulating smoke or underwater caustic refractions, whatever it is. It's nice, but it's gray and kind of boring. So let's add a little bit of color into all of this. I'll create another solid, and to this one I will add a gradient ramp. Now in the gradient ramp effect, you can only have 2 colors. So what I'd like to do is just use this black to white gradient as a map for a different effect called Colorama, which takes that transition of color and maps a whole other more complicated gradient onto it. And on this wheel, we can control where the colors are positioned. We can add colors or remove them, but I don't really want to have a wacky rainbow like this. I want something more subtle. There's a bunch of presets here, and I'll just use like this Caribbean color scheme. I'll go back to the gradient effect, just kind of pull on the handles here to just offset how the gradient is positioned, and something like that is good. Now it's a little too bright and happy still, so I think I'm going to just make everything more subtle by adding an exposure effect, and maybe a hue and saturation, and well, I have the box blur mapped as one of my go-to effects here, so I can just press the number 2 key, and that'll add my blur. Now, I'll tone it down, just take the exposure down and pull the gamma down a little bit. I'll shift the hue more toward pure blue from cyan, and this has made it very saturated, so I'll pull the saturation way down and add blur. I'll turn on this edge pixels option and just make it nice and soft. So we've got something going on. It's subtle, but I like the way it looks. So I'll pull this layer underneath the smoke that we've made, and let's just combine them using some sort of transfer mode. We have all these choices here, and oftentimes, I mean, I know kind of what they do, but I can't always predict what it's going to look like. So what you typically are doing is just looking through and checking how it looks. But it's annoying to always click here, so the best way is just to toggle through them by holding Shift and pressing plus or minus on the alphabet keyboard. And that way you can just see quickly the effects. Now, I kind of like this color dodge, and I think we can just tweak things. Maybe I'll make this thing a little bit more dark so that that smoke pattern has more room to exist. And the smoke itself, I'll play with the contrast and brightness of it to just make it nice and subtle, because this will be the very bottom thing in our stack of elements, so I do want it to be pretty subtle to begin with. Okay, so let's play through that. A couple of very, very basic effects put together in the right way already look pretty sophisticated. Like if I was in a real hurry, I could just slap this together and set it as a backdrop. But let's see what fun things we can add to this. So I will add another solid. And I'm thinking in my head, like, to make the backdrop as a sort of spacey, like Alice in Wonderland techno thing of some sort. And I think that a chessboard, a checkerboard pattern would somehow fit this vibe I'm imagining in my head. So to this new solid, I'm going to add the checkerboard effect. There we go. The checkerboard has a width by default of 16, and all video resolutions are usually in those sizes that are like multiples of 4 or whatever. So on the sides, these checkerboard squares are perfectly aligned with the edge of the frame. I want to keep it that way, so I can just double it to make it bigger, or make it even bigger like this. As long as I keep multiplying it like that, I'll have the squares match up against the edge. And I want to do that because I'm going to now animate them, and I want a frame of reference where I need to align them for that seamless loop. I'll show you what I mean. I'll go to the first frame, and I'm going to animate this anchor point, the x-axis of it, so that it scrolls gradually throughout the shot. So let me reset that and just add a keyframe and go to the last frame, and I'll just scroll it over a couple of times. And now I'll just look for, I guess right there, a place where I'll line up this edge with the actual squares. I'll zoom way in, and now I'll press home and end to compare. So it's pretty close. I think I need to roll it a little bit back. Okay, that's pretty much indistinguishable. So now we've got the same situation where the pattern is perfectly aligned, but now I'm going to press U again and move that keyframe just like we did with this one, so that that alignment plugs right into itself as it goes back to the first frame. And what we have is a seamless motion of this checkerboard all through the loop. Bam, very nice. Now that I've established that, let's integrate the checkerboard in some cool way into the scene. I'll turn the layer 3D by pressing the F4 key to reveal the switches and checking this 3D layer switch. Now I can press W and use these handles to rotate this thing one axis at a time, which is a nice way to kind of position it how you want it without getting lost. So I'll do something like this. Just move it over. And I don't like how shallow the perspective is in the default view in After Effects. So I'm going to add a camera, a 3D camera, by pressing Alt, Command, Shift, and C. And I'll leave it at 24 millimeters, which is a nice wide angle setting. So there, now we're looking through that kind of lens and our perspective is much more pronounced, which works for me. So let's pull it somewhere like this, and now I'll just magnify it and pull it back enough where the start and end of where the pattern is moving is out of the shot. Something like that. That's pretty nice. Okay. And now to do more things with this, I'm going to go ahead and pre-compose this, so I'm not working with a 3D object, but just an image of this composition. So I'll take the camera and the solid of the checkerboard, press Command-Shift-C, and we're going to be doing this a lot. We'll call this checkerboard. And now it's just a clip. So I can do things like soften this edge, for instance. I'll double-click here on this rectangle tool, which will create a mask around the entire image. And I can move that over like this, and then move these two edges, kind of align them with the direction of the squares. And now in this mask property, I can unlink the two axes of the feather property and just use the X one. So I'm blurring it side to side, but not up and down, so that these edges of the frame are not affected. So I'll blur it way out to see the edge, and then I'll pull back to make it just soft enough to fade out. And because we want to have a trippy, surreal look to everything, I think I want to distort it a little so that it's not just a straight scrolling across a surface. I want to give it like a curve. So I'll add a, what is it called? Bezier warp. And it's a tool for distorting the edges of the frame in a cool way. And I'll just pull it like this, and on this side as well. And it just gives it a little bit of an S shape. You don't want to overdo it with this tool or it gets out of control. That's cool. Nice river of checkerboard. Now, another thing I'll do by going back into the checkerboard comp and opening the camera's properties, the options here, I'll turn on depth of field and bump up the aperture way high so that we get this macro lens kind of shallow depth of field look, so things far away are blurry and close blurry, and then there's this band of focus. And even in that band of focus, I'm going to make things a little softer by adding an adjustment layer over the top of everything by pressing Alt-Command-Y. So it's like a transparent layer that we can put an effect on, and it will affect everything underneath. I'll add just my trusty old box blur, repeat edge pixels, maybe just bring it to 3, so that none of it is fully sharp, but that the top and bottom are much more out of focus. And now it's just a little more subtle. Now it's time for us to also get this to be integrated in some cool way rather than just a purely opaque pattern. So I'm thinking difference. Let's try this difference blend mode. And maybe I'll press T for opacity and just pull it down a little bit so that it recedes more into the fog. I'm thinking I want to make the backdrop even darker still. Something like that. I'll just tweak things along the way. Now, we've got this sort of river flowing this way now, diagonally. It would be nice to counteract it with some sort of elements that are going side to side like this on the other diagonal. So I'm imagining some sort of just lines, you know, like these like columns or bands that are just kind of gradually like floating across, but they're sort of distorting the view of what we have so far underneath them. So what I need to create is a bunch of pillars that will just kind of travel randomly from side to side, and then I'll position them in this diagonal manner. So let's get into that process now. I'll start by creating a solid again, but I won't make it the size of the composition. I'll just make it maybe like 30 pixels wide. So I've got this vertical stick. I'm going to solo it so we can just focus on what's going on. I just want a bunch of these kinds of sticks to roam around like this slowly, and I want them to get thick and thin and just intertwine randomly. And of course, I don't want to do this by keyframing everything because it's difficult to choreograph that and also to make it loop. So I'm going to use expressions to drive this behavior. And I did almost this exact same thing in the very first tutorial I did in this series, where I did kind of an interference pattern on a screen. This is a similar idea, but we're just going to take it a step further. So let me begin by just calling this stripe 1, because this is going to be one of several, and I want to be able to add a bunch of them and control all of their behavior together. But let's just build one of them, and then we can duplicate it. So what's an expression I could use to change the position of this thing? I'll press P to open the position property, and Alt-click on this stopwatch. Well, there's the trusty old wiggle command, which is followed by parentheses, and in these parentheses you put two numbers. You put the frequency of how fast the changes in position should happen in seconds, I guess. So let's say like 2. And then separated by a comma, you put a second number which designates the amplitude, meaning how far can it travel in pixels. So I'm going to say like 300. And if I enter that and preview, you could see that this stick is now just randomly flying around. And when we get to the end, there's a pronounced cut, obviously. So two things we don't want to happen is we don't want it to go up and down. We just want it to travel side to side. And the other thing is somehow this random wiggling behavior, we want it to end up in the exact same spot at the end as at the beginning and loop seamlessly. Well, I'm not an expert on expressions and I don't know a lot, so oftentimes you just want to refer to someone who's figured these things out for you. And just like in that first tutorial where I did this type of animation, I'm going to refer you to an excellent, if a little bit outdated website called motionscript.com, where this guy, Dan Eberts, he has figured out a lot of stuff that works as well today as it did in whatever version of After Effects was when this was written. And he's got some very useful kind of pre-made starter pieces of code that you can customize. So in this wiggle section, we've got both of the things we need. We have a way to loop the wiggle and we have a way to keep it moving in just one direction. So I'm going to go into this looping wiggle example. And he's got this nice little bit of code. I'm just going to copy it from here and paste it instead of this wiggle that I created. Now in his example, the loop time is 3 seconds, but our composition is 10. So I'm going to change that to 10. And I'm going to just put the same values I just had, 2 and 300. And what we'll see now is the stick is floating around the same way, but when it gets to the end, it'll perfectly, seamlessly loop in whatever motion it's doing. There we go. So that's one problem solved. Now, restricting it to one dimension part of this, I do remember myself, and we're just going to modify this expression. I'm just going to take this final line and I'm going to assign a variable to it. The variable x seems perfect because that is the axis on which we want things to move. I just need to put a semicolon at the end here. And now I need to tell the layer like what to output, I guess. And what I need to type is bracket followed by x, the variable we just created, a 0 in brackets, which refers to the first axis that this property has, which is the x-axis, and comma, the word value, which just refers to whatever this field says, these number fields, times 1, which is the y-axis, and close brackets. So what we're saying is, for the left and right motion, make it wiggle, and for the up and down motion, just keep it to whatever this number says. There we go. It moves left and right, and when it gets to the end, it loops seamlessly. Awesome. Now, as I said earlier, I don't want it to just move around. I want it to get thicker and thinner randomly as well. So this same expression could just be copied to the scale property. I'll just press Shift-S to open that. Alt-click on this and paste the expression in there. And the expression is identical with all the identical values, so now it's going to get fatter and thinner, sort of in tandem with the motion, which looks kind of strange, like a flat plank rotating. But we're going to change all these values around when we're looking at all the bands together. And in order to do that, I don't want to have to go into each of these two expressions on each of these stripes and changing those numbers. I need to control them globally. So we're going to set up a little thing here right above this layer. I'm going to press Alt, Command, Shift, Y. And that'll create a null layer, which won't do anything visual in the composition. But here I'll have a layer which I will call Stripe Control. And that's the layer where we're going to make all these adjustments. I'll add a slider control to it and duplicate it a few times. So we have 4 of them. And I wouldn't bother with this if I was working in a hurry, but just for the tutorial, I'm going to name all these things so that we see what's happening. So I'll call this position frequency. The second one is position amplitude. The next one is scale frequency. And finally, scale amplitude. And let's go into the layers now, and I'll press the tilde key to just free up some space. Press E to open up those effects. The sliders we just created, unfurl all of them. And let's go through these expressions and change, instead of hardwired typed in value here, we're just going to tell it, for this value, look at whatever this position frequency slider says. And for this one, whatever the position amplitude slider says. In this expression, the frequency is controlled by the scale frequency slider and the amplitude by the scale amplitude slider. Great. Now we can close this and we don't need to touch the expressions at all anymore. Now these sliders control everything, and now nothing's happening because all the sliders are at 0. So let's think for a moment what we want this to look like. In fact, at this point we can just create a bunch of stripes. Let's do like, I don't know, 7. I know that the composition is 1280 pixels wide. So from the middle, I want it to travel at least, 600 pixels or so. So I can confidently make this just over 600. And the frequency, I'll keep really low because I don't want them to move around too fast. So maybe like 1. Let's preview that. Even that is very fast. I think our number is going to have to be like 0.1, I guess. Yeah. I'm looking for motion more like this. And for the scale amplitude, I'm thinking like around 300-ish pixels. And frequency, similarly, like 0.1, 0.2. Something like that. I like the way that looks. So I will pre-compose this whole setup into a new composition. Just call it stripes. And now it's a clip with these stripes, which I can now position in the way that I want them to be positioned, as we were saying, diagonally. So let's turn this into a 3D layer. And again, use our W key, which is a shortcut for the rotate tool, to do something like this. And again, I'll add a camera, I guess, to give the perspective more extreme distortion. And since they're just stripes, I can distort them one axis at a time, and it's not going to make any difference. So I can make it really tall, so it goes beyond the frame like this, and then as wide as I need it to be to fill the frame as well. Let's preview that. Looks all right, but they're kind of conjugating up in this corner of the frame. I kind of want them to be here more. So I think what I could do is just press R to open the rotation properties, and just on the Z rotation, I can flip it around like this all the way to 180 degrees. Now they're more in our face. This is more what I want. Great. To be able to mess with it a little bit more, I'm going to pre-compose this as I did with the checkerboard. Command Shift C. Call this stripes angled. And I'll go into that comp. What I want to do is use it as a sort of displacement map. So I'll go into the stripes themselves here, and I will actually make them a little bit blurry, a little bit subtle. First of all, an adjustment layer with a blur, which will just soften them up just a little bit on the edges like this. And I want to not have them touch the edges of the frame, so I'll add a solid, except we need to make the solid the size of the comp, and I'll add a rectangle mask to it, go into the mask properties, shrink that mask by going in the negative on the mask expansion, and then feather it out, something like that, and then change the blend mode of this to stencil alpha, so it'll just kind of cut off anything beneath it to its own outlines. Let's go back into our comp and add an adjustment layer, stick it underneath the stripes, press F4 here and make the stripes layer an alpha matte for this adjustment layer. And I could add a displacement map effect, tell it to use the stripes and use the alpha channel of the stripes and change it by like 10 pixels by 10 pixels. What we're getting is kind of a distortion wherever the stripes are. It's like a heat distortion thing. And to make that a little more pronounced and clear, I think I could use curves, for instance, to just give them like a little light. They almost look like volumetric sort of light, except they also distort what's behind them. So whatever they are, some sort of energy waves, they're now messing with our background, just creating an extra little element. And they are looping seamlessly like everything else in our shot. Great. Now let's add a couple of more pronounced, bolder graphics elements, because so far this is kind of spacey and mysterious, but I want to add an element of technology to it. I'm thinking of some sort of like wavy lines of data or some kind of interface or something. And the way I'm going to do that is by creating rings with these geometric patterns, which I will then spin around, animate their rotation, and then I'll distort them to just make them kind of look crazy and trippy. So let's build one of those techno rings in a separate composition. Let's just create a new comp. And to make it really look detailed, I'm going to have to make this much bigger than our normal comp. So I'll just make it 1920 by 1920 for a perfect square, so that we have an easier time creating a perfect circle. Command Y to create another solid, and I will apply the fractal noise effect to it again. Only this one I will change to block. So we've got these little cutout sort of squares. I'll add another effect called find edges and reverse it or invert it. So we create this crazy tubular like network circuit board looking pattern almost. This is our base texture. We're going to create some shapes with it. So I'll move it down a little bit, like just past the middle of the frame here. And then I'll use our rectangle mask to just mask out a bunch of random improvised sort of bands like this. This should be enough. And now I'll interconnect them randomly and in cool ways. Something that looks kind of busy and like it has a purpose. I don't know. You can get as fancy with it as you want. Okay, that looks pretty good. And you'll see in a moment why I'm doing this. I'm basically going to distort this into a circle by adding an adjustment layer on top and putting a polar coordinates effect on it, switching this from rectangle to polar and pulling this into 100%. And bam, we have this techno sort of circle thing. Now, we are going to run into a little bit of a problem because of our loop. Because ordinarily, I make something cool like this. Let's actually pre-compose this, call it wheel pattern. And now we can rotate this guy. We can just create an animation of it turning. But because of our seamless loop needs over here, the only thing we can really do with this odd shape is if it turns 360 degrees and ends up in the exact same clock position at the beginning, that's the only way it can loop cleanly. But the problem is, I think spinning it all the way 360 degrees over 10 seconds is just going to be a little too fast for the mood of this background. So I'm going to have to make this circle look in such a way that every 90 degrees, it'll look identical. And a very lazy and quick way to do that would be just to duplicate this pattern, change its transfer mode to add, then rotate this 90 degrees, duplicate it again, rotate it 180, duplicate a third time, rotate 270. Now it looks very busy now because We've copied it so much. So we can go back to the original one and actually scale up the noise by a lot. Maybe increase the contrast just to make this initial circle less busy. And then this guy looks a little more interesting. So we have our circle. I can either pre-compose this again, but why don't I just add a null object to which I'll parent all of these guys. And then rotate, create a keyframe. In the first frame, rotate it 90 degrees or minus 90. I want it to go counterclockwise. As you can see, it looks like nothing happened because the circle is identical in that alignment. Again, I'll go to the last frame, push it one frame ahead to perfectly match our loop. As you can see, there it is turning. Let's be neat and call this comp wheel. And while we're at it, let's call our main composition main, so we know what we're outputting at the end. Now we'll stick this wheel into this comp, make it a 3D layer, push it back, and let's find some kind of angle for it. Something like this. Change the transfer mode or the blend mode to add. Duplicate it. Stick it over here. Maybe rotate it a different way. And duplicate it a third time. Let's see what we can do with this. And this is what we get. And because our wheel is already pre-looped in its own little animation, all of these, no matter how we position and how many of these we make, they're all going to loop seamlessly. Look at that. Perfect. Now that we've established this basic arrangement, let's pre-comp wheel trio. Okay. We'll have to set this back to add. And let's just treat them a little bit. They're kind of loud here, so let's add a tint effect to them. 100%, make them kind of bluish. Something like this. Lower their opacity and add a glow effect, which may or may not work in this situation. But let's see. Yeah, that's not too bad. And now for that distortion, I'm going to use turbulent displace. I'll actually put it above the glow. That would make more sense. And this already looks fine, I guess, the way it is. Can tweak these a little bit, but that pretty much looks how I expected. Maybe a little bit more transparent. Very cool. Now let's round everything out with a little bit of particles just floating around, because you gotta have particles. I'll add one more solid and bring in particle world. And we get our crazy default sparkler thing. Let's change this up one step at a time. I always find it kind of overwhelming working with all the parameters of a particle system. So I keep all these things twirled down and I just open the one thing at a time that I need. So let's go into particle, just change them from this line to, I guess, faded sphere is good. Let's set the color to white. So it'll go from like whitish to reddish dots. Let's make the birth size a little smaller and death size even smaller. And the opacity map, they kind of fade in, live, and fade out. I want them to fade in and then almost immediately be fading out their entire existence. Something like that. Now let's close the particle, open the physics tab, set the velocity to 0, set gravity to 0. So now they just pop into existence and nothing else and disappear. They don't move at all. So this frees us up to readjust what the producer of the particles looks like. So let's make it really wide and really tall. So it just becomes like a star field. And I guess let's look at how they behave. This is kind of what I want, but I'm going to slow down. I want to slow this twinkling down. So I'll actually reduce the birth rate, but increase their lifespan so they stay on screen longer and kind of fade out gradually. Something like this works okay. The only thing is we start with nothing and then they kind of populate, and then it starts looking the same all the time. So I'm going to go like halfway point, set an endpoint for this layer, go to the beginning, drag it into the start of the comp, and then extend it so that our particle system has begun before the shot has begun. So it's always like this. And that looks nice, but of course this won't seamlessly loop. We're just creating new particles all the time, so it'll just boom, cut to a different look. And I'm afraid the only way we can loop this is by just cheating and cross-fading it into itself during the shot. So let's do that. I'll pre-comp this, and I'll make sure to move all this effect into the new comp. I'll call this particles, and I'll go into the new comp and actually make it a bit longer than our final composition so that we have room to crossfade. Now here in our main comp, I'll go to the exact halfway point. Our comp is 10 seconds long, so I'm going to go to 5 seconds exactly, and then press the star or the asterisk key on the number pad to add a little marker. Then I'll duplicate the layer, and the first one I will put so that that marker is on the first frame. And in the last one, I put it on the last frame, or more precisely, the frame after the last frame, as we've been doing with everything else. So this will loop, at least at the beginning and the end, it's looping into the same moment in time. But here in the middle, somewhere along the way, we now have them overlapping, and we're going to crossfade this thing. And let's just make a nice long crossfade. I'll add a keyframe here, go from 0 to 100. Similarly here, T for opacity, fade to 0. And just to stagger them a little bit, I'm going to select this keyframe, press F9 to ease it. Select this keyframe, press F9 to ease that. And now, hopefully, let's play through this. Let's see how noticeable this fade is. It's pretty unnoticeable. Just because everything is fading in and out constantly, it's nearly impossible to tell where this happens. So let's call that a loop. And I could pre-compose it again to adjust the transparency here, but let me show you a different way where you can add a transform effect, which I've recently started using. It's kind of cool because basically anything that a layer can do, position, rotation, opacity, you can do as an effect on a layer, and sometimes that's more useful. For instance, here we're using opacity to fade in and out, but we can still control the overall opacity of the layer with this. And I'll copy this effect onto the other particle layer. And for a second, let me just unfurl those effects because I want to link up the opacities together. So I'll take the opacity of this one, alt-click the stopwatch, and simply point it to this one so that now an expression's driving this opacity, and I only need to control it in the bottom particles layer. Now I'm just going to slide this to decide how prominent do I want these particles to be in here. And I'm going to make them real subtle, like this. And as a final touch to everything, let's add kind of a vignette to the edges of the frame. So I'll add an adjustment layer, again, Alt-Command-Y, and let's add an exposure, hue saturation, and box blur. So let's darken this, pull it a little bit further into blue-purple territory, desaturate, and blur. And now I'll add a rectangle mask. There it is. I will shrink it, reverse it by setting this to subtract, and then blur out the edges. And we've got our nice little vignette to make it look a little inexplicably cooler and better. Looks like I forgot one thing in the particles, and that is to reintroduce a little bit of motion to them. I like how they twinkle now. So let's go back into physics and just bring some gravity back, like really subtle amount of gravity. Something like that. Except I don't want it to fall down. So let's go into gravity vector, change this to 0, and change this to -1. So now they're being pulled to the left. So there's just a little bit of a scrolling motion happens. Maybe 0.007 might be a good speed. Yeah, I like that. Okay, final preview of the final shot. Looks pretty good. All that's left to do is to render it out. So let's just press Command-Shift/, to add it to the render queue. I'm using the render queue because I don't want to make an MP4, something to put online. This is going to be for us to use in our editing and compositing work, so we're going to use some kind of professional format like ProRes. HQ should be good. I'll disable sound because there's no audio in this animation. Let's just set it to our whatever folder you're going to collect these things in and call this Cosmic Chess Loop. Let's render it out. And now we've got an asset we can use whenever we want. Just as an example, let's say you were working at a later date on something and you have some other kind of comp and you've got like graphics. Now you can just focus on the content. That sounds like things that are in graphics. And you just have to worry about this. Now you've got a whole library of backgrounds you can just slap on there. So let's bring our chess loop. We'll pop it in here. It's not as long as this particular scene needs to be, so I could duplicate it and line it up a bunch of times, but just to avoid creating extra layers, I can go in here, right-click, go into Interpret Footage, and down here set as many loops as I want. If my video is an hour, I can just loop this like 500 times, but here 3 should be enough, and now I can just stretch it out, and so our loop's gonna just be there. We don't have to worry about it. We can just keep working. If you want to adjust how it looks, you can always just throw on those same effects we've been using. Exposure, hue saturation, and blur. And once again, just, maybe it's a little too busy for this text. I'll darken it as much as I need to. Maybe desaturate it. Get that blur going. And it suddenly becomes very appropriate. And if we want to change the mood, we can always just shift the hue of the whole thing. Maybe it's more technological if it's green or something. And we've got this working. We can adapt it for all kinds of situations. Maybe you even want to make it bigger and this works better for you. There you go. So take time once in a while to build things like this. Just sit there when there's no pressure, when nothing's due. Just play around with these things, create a bunch of different looks, and just stockpile them for later. And they might just save your life someday.